Welcome back again, everyone, to part 2 of our Chapter 6 lecture series. This section is entitled Toward Religious Toleration. The focus question for this section is, how did the expansion of religious liberty after the Revolution reflect the new American ideal of freedom? The period of the Great Awakening that we discussed in the last chapter greatly expanded the options of religious choice for Americans in the 18th century. And at the end of the American Revolution, religious toleration, the acceptance of all of those various options, became more and more intimately tied with the concept of American freedom itself. The Revolution also weakened the deep tradition of American anti-Catholicism, that alliance with Catholic France that was so integral to the American victory in the Revolution had much to do with that process. Now, with that being said, it did not eliminate anti-Catholicism in the Americas at the time, but it did help reduce the persecution of Catholics and foster a more general acceptance of Catholicism as another one of the myriad religious choices that Americans could make. Now, at the same time, as this religious choice was expanding and religious toleration and freedom became more and more synonymous, many were also reducing the influence of religion in their own lives and calling for a reduction of the influence of religion in political and social lives as well. Many founders viewed religion through that lens of Enlightenment principles, particularly rationalism and skepticism. And this is reflected in the movement of deism that we spoke about as well in the last chapter. The idea of a clockwork God, of a God who set the machinery in motion and then stood back to watch things unfold without participating or having any direct hand in day-to-day human affairs. All of these things coalesced into a more religiously tolerant society, while at the same time also helping to separate religion and politics more and more as time drew on. Both the devout and the not-so-devout each called for a greater separation of church and state during this period. The not-so-devout, the deists, and those like them, thought that the separation of church and state was necessary to protect politics and intellect from the undue influence of religion. While the flip side of that, the more devout, particularly those evangelical Protestants, thought that the separation of church and state was necessary to protect religion from the corruptions of government. Each questioned the privileged position of the Anglican Church in American society. In most colonies, the Anglican Church had been the legally protected and official church of the realm. States began to deprive those established churches of public funding. They removed those taxes placed on people, even those who did not participate in the church, from the legal structures in order to separate out the government from religion and vice versa. Now, there were limits to religious freedom still at this time, but they mainly targeted Jews and Catholics at this point. Both were free to worship. However, Jews and Catholics in most cases were restricted from active political participation. There was still the general consensus that only Protestant Christians could fully participate in an American republic or governmental system. Thomas Jefferson actually led the charge to further separate church and state after the American Revolution. In 1786, he presented to the Virginia legislature the bill for establishing religious freedom, which eliminated religious requirements for voting and holding office, as well as eliminated the government support of churches. This bill was passed, and the ideas enshrined in this bill also spread spread very quickly to other states in this new American Union. And this bill and others like it began this process of the coalescing of the greater idea of the role of government and the protection of certain individual rights. The bill for establishing religious freedom was fundamentally about protecting rights from government interference. And the model of religious liberty became more and more tied to this definition of rights as private matters to be protected from the government, not necessarily by the government. This also helped to sharpen the line even further between public and private matters and the spheres in which each of those things was accorded. The American Revolution continued that process begun during the Great Awakening of the 18th century of enhancing religious diversity in America. New religious denominations proliferated at this time, especially Protestant Christian denominations. At the same time, there evolved this new ideal known as Christian republicanism. Even though leaders began to call more and more for an increased separation of church and state, most still believed that a healthy nation needed both government and religion to fully function properly in society. Religion, they believed, reinforced the morality necessary for a thriving republican form of government. Religion taught the values of personal virtue that they believed were the foundation of a free society. And that personal virtue translated directly into civic and public virtue. That concludes part 2 of our Chapter 6 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.